and have preached ever since. Just finished 56 years of ministry to the deaf. Some of the things that you can't read about my wife, she was saved 1949, made sure of her salvation in 1965, but graduated from nursing school. She's an RN, also has a MA, master's degree in Bible counseling, and will do most of the counseling for our church with the women now. She has 5 that she's working with, and one is a Jewish lady that just popped up about 2-3 months ago, and she's beginning to meet with her once in a while, once a week, and talk with her about the Messiah. Okay? This is my home church in Tennessee. It's in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I live in Georgia, but I travel back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Not as long as from Ken Mackey's home to here. It takes me less than 10 minutes from my home to the church. This is my mission board, COME, and you'll remember we before had COME, now we're COME, International Baptist Ministry. We wanted to add the name Baptist to our ministry. That's my sending church in Derby, Kansas. I travel, as you know, all over America, preaching to the deaf and hearing. The purpose is to encourage people to surrender to work with the deaf people, not only here in America, but in many, many different foreign countries also. 1993, I made my first trip to a different foreign country, Romania, and I went over in January of 1993. Cold, yeah. I promised never to do that again. But I almost froze. But there I met with an interpreter for the deaf. And I asked her, I said, do the deaf have a Bible class or a church service of any kind here? She said, I've interpreted for the deaf 33 years. They've never had a Bible class or a church service of any kind. Really touched my heart, and I said, I will come back and I will preach to the deaf here. Well, in the spring, I went for 4 weeks to learn the Romanian Sign Language. Then David Hansen and I went back in the fall in November and preached to the deaf in 3 different cities. Many of them probably the first time that the deaf had ever heard the gospel. So since that time, I have touched 18 different foreign countries, and I have preached to the deaf in 8 different sign languages and had deaf people saved in 5 of those. So very happy. Of course, when we go to a new country, the first thing that we have to do is learn the sign language. And this is in Uruguay, in South America. This is a missionary that invited me to come into that country. Found out that there was a deaf church there with a deaf man as the pastor of that church. And I went there and found out that they had printed a sign language book, but it's in Spanish. I don't understand Spanish. So we sat and I write the English word in every picture, every picture, every picture. Then the deaf pastor came over to the house and we signed through that book. Many signs were wrong.
Of course.
And I asked him, I said, this was printed, this was in 2007 that it was printed, this was 2009. And I said, why so many wrong signs? He said, because they're not asked to death. Yeah, so, you remember Mark chapter 16 verse 15, it says, go preach. And I go into the different foreign countries to learn sign language there so that I can preach to the deaf. I want to improve their life, but if improve their life and they die and go to hell, what profit? So I go to preach the gospel to the deaf in these different countries. Like Brazil, I'll be going back there in January next year. I'm making the plans now to apply for visa, airline tickets and so forth, planning that now. Full month of January. We have 2 deaf camps and 1 training interpreters, and then I will be preaching in 2 different deaf churches while there. All of the other, Peru, so forth. In Bulgaria, we arrived in one name of the city is called Varna. V-A-R-N-A, Varna, that's the sign Varna. There's nothing for the deaf there, and so we have Bible study classes, and I'll show you that in just a moment. But then we heard about a deaf school in another city, and in the paper this morning here, in the travel section, they have a thing and some pictures about that city. It's called Plovdiv, Plovdiv. The sign is this. And I've been there many times. And we found out that there was a deaf church there because we just showed up at a hearing church and we preached on Sunday morning. Well, Sunday afternoon, we saw this group of people coming. They were signing. The deaf church had heard that there were 2 Americans that had come. One was deaf and one preached to the deaf, and they came to the church. So you know what happened? We had Bible study class. We taught them, and the man there in the middle, this man right here, that man was saved that afternoon. And we got to talking. This is the pastor. So this is David right there. And we began to talk, and we found out that he had been trained very little, almost none. And so we began to talk with him and said, if David and I come back, can we help you and train you? Yes, 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 yes. So David and I went back about 3 times and stayed in Plovdiv and trained this deaf man to be pastor of a deaf church. All right? It was very interesting. We would go into a restaurant in the afternoon at about 4. We would sit around. We eat supper or dinner, if you're fancy. We eat supper, and then we would sit around for 4 hours in that restaurant. They would not kick us out. It's the culture there. Many times you'll go into a restaurant and buy a drink, and sit there and sit there and sit there and talk and talk and talk. They not bother you. And so David on this end of the table, teaching and teaching, his Bible open, books open, teaching this pastor. I'm on this other end. There's a lady there that spoke English that was the interpreter for the deaf, and I was training her in rules of interpretation and so forth. It was very, very interesting. Deaf lady saved. I've traveled all over Peru. Many deaf people saved in Peru. In Hungary, I was contacted by this couple right here, and they said, we would like to establish a deaf ministry. Can you come and help us? Yeah, I said, yeah, I can come and help you. So I went and taught, starting on Friday night, all day Saturday. Sunday, we suspended for church, and then Sunday afternoon, I taught and taught and taught and taught. When I finished and left, she's pregnant. You can see that. She's pregnant. Had really difficult birth. Many operations on the baby, also forth. And so I never heard nothing. And I thought, devil won again. Now, wasted my time. About 3 years ago, I received an email from her. And she says, I don't know if you'll remember me, but I had a special name for you. Hungarian words like this. I couldn't pronounce it. I heard it. I could not pronounce it, but it means grandfather. Yeah. So she said that, and she wrote that in the letter, and she said, I hope you will remember me. And I thought to myself, yes, I remember. She said, I want to explain to you what happened. She said, went through operations, some medical problems and everything. She said about 2 years, we began to invite the deaf to come into the church. It grew to about 20 to 25 deaf people. They wanted their own church, so they established their own deaf church and chose their deaf man to become pastor of that church. There's now a deaf church in Valencia, Hungary. Yes. This is Romania. We trained this young man. 1994, the first person to surrender in a foreign country to work with the deaf. And I began to train him to preach, just very skilled preach to the deaf, still doing it today.
Yeah.
There's a picture here of several of the deaf that have been saved. The woman in the middle here is another young lady that we trained to interpret for the deaf. I was in Romania about 4 years ago, and it was a special day. This was a young deaf man that was being baptized, and I took a picture of him. And this is Cornell. He preaches to the deaf every Saturday. They have come together for Saturday Bible class and so forth. And then on Sunday morning they meet in the hearing church with interpreters. So good ministry. France. How many times in my travel